everyone. Welcome. My name is Leslie Gentarosimi, and I'm the Associate Director for Energy and Climate at the Bipartisan Policy Center, helping to lead our new Farm and Forest Carbon Solutions Initiative. Thanks for spending part of your day with us, and feel free to use the live chat function on YouTube or on Twitter to say hello and tell us where you're joining from. Today's webinar is part of a series we're doing on different topics related to natural climate solutions, taking advantage of the natural ability of our agricultural soils and forests to sequester and store carbon, and working with farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners to adopt carbon-smart practices. So, as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has created tremendous economic and employment challenges and ongoing uncertainties about the path towards recovery. EPC has published a set of recommendations for federal policies that can help agriculture and rural economies, and it's available on the website you see here on the screen and in the chat function. We've also just released a new blog post on 4 ways that rural broadband fights climate change, including ways that Congress can accelerate this kind of infrastructure investment for economic recovery. So check out all of BPC's policy resources for our Farm and Forest Carbon Solutions Initiative on our website. I'm joined today by experts to get their challenges and opportunities to boost the rural and natural resources-based economy while also taking steps to tackle climate change. I'm going to briefly introduce everyone, and then I'll kick things off with some questions for our panelists. And we have some time set aside at the end of our session for audience Q&A. So for those of you viewing today, you can think of your questions and use the live chat feature on YouTube, see live on Twitter to submit any questions for the panel. Jonathan Kappas is our first guest today. He is a faculty member at the University of Illinois at Champaign, a gardener. He previously served as a at USDA and Chief Counsel for the Senate Ag Committee and as Legislative Assistant to Senator Ben Nelson. Second, we have Colin O'Mara, the President and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation, America's largest wildlife conservation organization. In this capacity, he serves on numerous national policy councils and is regularly called before Congress to testify about wildlife, water, and sportsman issues. And prior to this, Colin led the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control as Cabinet Secretary and served as the state's top natural resource official. And finally, we'll welcome Christy Plummer, who has served for the past 4 years as the Chief Conservation Officer at the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. Prior to this, she's held leadership positions at Solar City, the Nature Conservancy, the Conservation Fund, and Senate EPW's Subcommittee on Fisheries, Wildlife, and Water. So, Jonathan, I'm going to start with a question for you. So from a layperson's perspective, it seems like agriculture should be doing okay in the current economic situation, since, even during a pandemic, we all are still, need to buy food. But we know that's really not the whole story. And we've seen news coverage of the challenges with food supply and other issues. So can you talk about some of your work that you're doing at University of Illinois and some context on the issues and challenges facing producers?
Yeah, happy to do so. And first off, just want to say thanks for having me on. And I look forward to this conversation with everybody on this topic and thinking through maybe what we can do when we emerge from some of the challenges we face. So to your point, yeah, we all got to eat. And you would think that would keep things moving. I think the big things that we have seen, as you noted, that the supply chain itself has gone through some pretty significant disruptions around COVID-19, the pandemic, the economic shutdown, and all the things that we have tried to do to address that. Largely because of what's happened with restaurants and food service industries and schools, hotels, and the like. It's really upended some of the supply chain. For farmers in general, and here at University of Illinois, we do a lot of work. Part of my appointment is extension, and so we do a lot of work with farmers and farm groups, particularly corn and soybeans, which is the predominant crops in this state. And really, farmers have kind of the COVID pandemic really comes on the heels of quite a few challenges economically and financially for them. We've seen lower prices since 2014 with really large crops, and then we've had the the tariff conflict, particularly as it played out with China and retaliatory tariffs on things like soybeans, that had then added another layer of economic challenge for farmers. And then you come back into the COVID pandemic, and everything from the food supply system we mentioned to continuing issues around export markets and trade disruptions, and then things like the ethanol industry and the attempt to produce biofuels from our fields, and how people driving fewer miles means they're buying less fuel, and that has really also taken a huge toll on the ethanol industry that particularly is what we've been trying to stand up since about 2005. So quite a few different challenges that have come farmers' way here in the last few years. I think
we're gonna get Colin up here in just a second. Oh, thanks for bearing with us. We could also skip over to Christy if that's easier. Oh no, now we got 4 of us. Colin, you want to go ahead?
I didn't hear the question. The question didn't come through.
Can you just repeat sorry about that.
Yeah.
So I was saying, can you describe the work of NWF and how you're approaching conservation during these challenging times? And what would you say to those who think conservation is a luxury that we should only prioritize when the economy's good?
No, thanks, Leslie. And it's great to be with all of you. Look, I mean, this is a pandemic that started because of our abuse of wildlife. This is a zoonotic disease that, as we're encroaching further and further into habitats, in this case overseas, and the kind of illicit wildlife trade not being regulated or kind of stopped in many ways, led to this global, kind of shutdown of so much of the global economy. And at the same time, one of the biggest sources of respite during the pandemic has been nature. So many families and individuals are turning to nature for exercise or just for sanity, trying to enjoy the outdoors. We're seeing a record number of folks enjoying the amazing lakes and forests and trails across the country. As we're getting into hunting season right now, obviously folks are out, for doves and other species. And also recognizing that a lot of folks don't have access to nature, that, we've got a lot of kind of recreation deserts across the country. But I think where we think about this kind of holistically is just as, kind of the abuse of nature was related to the beginning of this pandemic, investments in conservation and restoration in particular is one of the ways we're going to get out of the economic disaster that we're in right now. We need to create tens of millions of jobs in the coming years, and frankly, investments in natural resource restoration and resilience create more jobs per dollar you spend than almost anything else. And so, what better solution than investing in our wetlands and our grasslands and our forests, places that can sequester carbon and help in the climate question, can create tons of jobs, support local economies, and at the same time provide great wildlife habitat. They help reduce air pollution and water, and help clean up waterways. They also help. On a whole range of other kind of co-benefits. And so we view this as making the case, look, it's not a nicety, it's truly a necessity. And that if we look back at the places where we've had to create massive numbers of jobs in the past, particularly the Great Depression, many of the most successful programs were conservation programs in terms of getting folks back to work, right? The Civilian Conservation Corps, some of the public WPA projects. And so really we think the road to recovery runs right through conservation.
Thanks so much. Christy, I'm going to turn to you. Love to hear a little bit more about the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership and the hunting and fishing community's stance on natural climate solutions.
Thanks, Leslie. And thank you again for this opportunity from Bipartisan Policy Center. I've worked with BPC for a long time, and it's really great to see you all taking a lead role again in the climate issues. TRCP is a partnership organization. We're an umbrella organization for a number of hunting, fishing, outdoor recreation, and businesses. We have 61 partners on our policy council. NWF is one, Collins Group, and represent a broad scope of hunters and anglers across the country. And we've been engaged in climate and natural climate solutions now for about 12 years. And I've actually got props. So this Season's End document was a collaborative effort with Bipartisan Policy Center, and actually then came Beyond Season's End. And that was put together back in 2008 when Waxman-Markey legislation was very active, and the hunting and fishing community came together back then to say we are on the front lines of a changing climate and want to be part of the solution, and really doing a lot of education back then, and have continued to do education on the changes we see in the environment from a changing climate, migration shifts. A lot of timing in terms of if you're out fishing, insect hatches might not be occurring at the right time. For those of our partners and members that hunt, the shifts in migration phases for ducks and other migratory birds, and how that lines up with our hunting seasons is a problem. So, we're thinking about this constantly, especially as Colin mentioned, as we're heading into hunting season right now. I think in terms of natural climate solutions, from this era of putting these information publications together with Seasons End, Beyond Seasons End, we were thinking a lot about adaptation back then. And there's a lot of opportunities now. We've gotten a lot more sophisticated. The science has gotten a lot better about what natural climate solutions look like. And it's about building climate resilience in our systems and ensuring these systems can withstand this changing climate. So not just adapting to the changes, but ensuring that we have more resilience and are tapping into this large land and water base in the United States for how do we build natural resilience, and tap into the natural climate solution opportunities.
I am jealous that I don't have any props to share. That was great. And maybe as a follow-up, could you say a little bit, about how the connection that your work is with the outdoor recreation industry, and how a piece of that connects here?
Yeah, sure. And we're thinking about that a lot. I mean, both Jonathan and Colin mentioned that, we're with COVID and the pandemic, we've had huge disruptions within our economic systems. It certainly has impacted the outdoor recreation economy. So hunting and fishing are a key part of that economy. Right now, Bureau of Economics assessment has calculated this economy to be worth $778 billion in terms of economic output. And the hunting, fishing, shooting sports component of that is about $200 billion. So it's a significant part. And we've seen a lot of impacts happening in terms of COVID. Outdoor recreation roundtable, outdoor industry associations done a lot of work on this. So, if you think about 36 million anglers out there, 11.5 million hunters, we're heading into hunting season. Some people are getting out. In some cases, we do see increases in fishing and hunting licenses, which drives a lot of how our state and federal agencies do their business and do their work. In other places, things are down, and especially for small businesses, there's been huge economic impact in terms of what that sector's been seeing. So it's problematic. Well, I think we'll go into a little bit more detail on that later, but it's a powerhouse of a sector, and it's certainly facing some challenges right now.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm going to go back to you, and I know you have really extensive experience with Farm Bill and agricultural extension. So, can you tell us a little bit more about the opportunities that might be within Department of Agriculture conservation programs for farmers to access kind of new sources of revenue and get that boost that they are looking for?
Yeah, and I want to actually build off of something that Colin said, because it kind of struck me for a minute when he said the word investment. And I really think that when we think about conservation policy and what the Farm Bill does, we need to really, I think, elevate the fact that this is the largest federal investment in conservation on private lands that we have. It's roughly $5 to $6 billion a year, and it's spread through a multitude of programs. but it's a key component of the Farm Bill. It's a key component of an investment in conserving our natural resources. Everything from the recreational potential that both Colin and Christy mentioned to the incredible importance of soil for farming and the ability to improve soil health, improves organic matter, water retention and holding capacity, and then obviously the follow-on benefits that come from that through improving water quality and even reducing water usage. So the Farm Bill roughly invests about $5 or $6 billion. Farmers in general, I think you can kind of divide the programs into two different categories. They're the reserve programs, so the conservation reserve and the wetlands reserve type concept, where we take acreage out of production and we put it under a conservation practice for generally a long term of time. And that, I think, helps feed. I think we've seen a lot of the benefits of that in recreational sectors and the ability for habitat. And then the other side of it, and it's something we work a lot on here in a state like Illinois that's a very big production, a lot of great soils and ground that aren't likely to go into a permanent cover situation, although we've seen a lot of work around wetlands. But now we think of the working lands programs, the environmental quality incentives program and the conservation stewardship type program. And we're investing funds into the farmer and into the farm production practices to improve its conservation, the conservation outcomes on that land. So everything from helping farmers, cover this cost of, say, cover crops. And cover crops are a practice that will help reduce soil erosion, will also help scavenge nitrogen and keep it from being lost to the waterways and feeding dead zones. So those are some of the types of investments that we have right now. But they also, I think, really set us up for some of this discussion about the kinds of policies we've got in place and how they work as we think through various ways in which American agriculture can be a real partner and a real contributor to efforts around climate resilience and adaptation and carbon sequestration and all that that's incredibly important as we go forward. So there's a lot there, and certainly we can always do more, but it is an important investment.
Definitely. And, maybe as a follow-up, could you say a little bit about the barriers that producers might be facing considering whether to conservation?
So, yeah, and that's a tough question. Many farmers are actively adopting conservation. Many of them view the long-term benefits to their farm, to their land. Many farmers are going to view this in terms of the generations that have come before them and that will come after them in farming, and so they want to invest in that. But we said it there. I said at the beginning, the challenges from low prices and income hits to the tariff war and conflict also impacting economics, and now COVID. Those challenges also challenge conservation because ultimately, farmers got to make money to continue that operation. And you can look at different conservation practices that are themselves bringing cost into the operation, maybe even adding some risk to some of that management, farm management, and the decision making around it. And so those exist no matter what. It's going to cost you money to put in cover crops. It's going to cost money to take some acreage out of production for, say, a grass waterway or a wetland. Yeah, there's federal assistance that can come in and help. But there's a tough aspect of that when you're managing the finances, and we think about, frankly, some of the extremely competitive components of farming. Things are like cash rent, and the challenges that farmers have when there are other operations seeking to come in and offer higher cash rents on acreage that you've been trying to improve soil health on, and so that's where the policy really can fit in, trying to understand the gap that farmers have as they try to adopt conservation, understanding the counter-cyclical aspects of it that we see right now, that when prices are down, when incomes are down, that challenge grows for farmers seeking to adopt conservation. And if we start rethinking policies, we should start thinking about how we fill back in when the economic hits come so that they can continue to invest in conservation, and that we understand that sometimes those investments take multiple years and may not even return, back to the bottom line for the farmer. So there's a lot of those aspects that come with it that as kind of a policy dork, that's where we focus. And that's where we really want to be looking a lot at how those gaps can be investments from the federal side of the equation.
Thanks. That's really helpful to better understand some of the complexities of how all of these issues kind of compound. And Colin, I'm thinking now on the forest side and what your thoughts are in terms of the opportunities in forest restoration. Jonathan spoke a bit about some of the idea of environmental co-benefits associated with conservation practices. And so where do you anticipate big direct benefits or co-benefits from investments in natural climate solutions on the forest side?
Yeah, and I think Jonathan hit it exactly right. I mean, thinking through the entire marketplace and how we really try to make, whether it's an individual farmer or forest steward, or it's a community whole in this environment, is going to be important. I mean, I want to see especially private landowners be compensated for the values they're providing. And so if folks are sequestering carbon, we should make sure there's a marketplace they can sell into. I mean, ideally, if they're providing value for endangered species or other types of values, we're compensating that. And so they're not forced to kind of farm a subsidy, but they can kind of get rewarded for all the different many values that they're providing. Same thing on the forestry side, right? I mean, kind of good forest management is going to reduce risk. And so there's potential benefits for insurance markets potentially for folks that kind of do right by the landscape, because you're less likely to have these mega fires if you're having some prescribed burns or better some thinning or just basic ecologically sound management. There's huge clean water values coming off landscapes. There's drought benefits. I mean, managing forests well is a good way to absorb more water and have a more rational kind of flow. The wildlife benefits are absolutely astronomical with our forests. But I do think it's important to kind of think about the difference between kind of private lands versus kind of public lands in this case. And kind of the ownership does matter in some cases. One's going to have to be more incentives and hopefully market creation and potentially having protocols. There's a lot of conversations right now between folks like Senator Stabenow and Senator Braun and others, thinking about how those markets could work. But on the public side, we have to invest. I mean, a lot of us worked really hard on the funding issues around the way we fight wildfires in this country, because we end up draining the entire Forest Service budget and then not having money at the end of the day to actually do the active restoration and management of our forests. I mean, there's no one that worked harder on it than one of your fellows, Robert Bonney, for many years. And at the end of the day, but that's still not enough money, right? I mean, it's a few $100 million, which is a lot, but we have restoration deficits of 65, 70, 75 million acres just on our national forests, and it's before you get to the forests that are on BLM lands. And so I do think there are opportunities to compensate folks for multiple values on private lands, but on the public side, we have to invest. There's not enough kind of value to be taken off the landscape through public-private partnerships to pay for this stuff by itself. I mean, if it's a priority, if it's going to make us safer, if it's going to help us meet our climate goals, it's going to strengthen local economies. These are areas that deserve public investment. And as we're looking at ways to kind of grow out of this recession, which hopefully will not be a depression by then, but likely will be, frankly, there's very few places that are better to invest than our public land, and specifically our forests.
Thanks, Colin. Christy, it seems like this idea of putting Americans back to work through conservation, it has a real bipartisan appeal. And, we've seen for the first time several Republicans in Congress signaling interests in policies that talk about storing carbon in trees or in the land. So, I'd be curious to hear more about recent work that you've done with partners highlighting the potential for natural climate solutions to address issues that are, near and dear to sportsmen and women.
Thanks, Leslie. Yeah, we feel there's a lot of potential and something we've been gearing up on as part of a post-COVID recovery. I think all of us know in terms of spaces where we can go right now for our mental sanity and to get out with our families and friends, it's been outdoors. And you think about the potential, whether it's in the urban spaces, the rural spaces, to do more post-COVID recovery. Back in 2009, after the Great Recession, we had an American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. We also had another signature piece of supplemental emergency funding that went out after Sandy, as well as some of the other hurricanes. And there were real opportunities through these packages to think about how do we generate new jobs, focused on what the needs are of the United States when it comes to the conservation needs that we have. So if you think about climate resilience, whether it again is uplands way up in the Mississippi River system in areas that have withstood a ton of flooding recently and some of the climate impacts there, there are enormous opportunities, and we've got potential to do a lot of mapping, get the science right, but for floodplain restoration work, where you've got individuals who are designing, engineering, moving dirt, restoring floodplains, doing replannings, all of that generating jobs and economic stimulation for the local communities. And then, with the engineering and the more sophisticated climate data that we have, we know how to build those floodplains in a way that is going to support and protect the communities adjacent to it. So if you think about blowing that out nationally and thinking through, what does an ARA in 2021 look like? And how can we tap into that type of stimulus and jobs, economic recovery to really ensure that we're doing conservation right and using the best, latest climate data, using a lot of the new sophisticated engineering that's come out from partners like Nature Conservancy or Ducks Unlimited that have been doing, wetlands restoration, oyster reef restoration, coastal resilience restoration work, floodplain resilience restoration work, and really look at these opportunities for natural climate solutions and climate resilience to be economic generators. So with our partners, we've been pushing out some messaging on Conservation Works for America, and are doing a lot of work up in Congress and with the administration, and teeing up as part of the ongoing election cycle, talking to both sides about what this might look like in 2021 and beyond.
That's great. So for those in the audience, we have about 15 minutes, and then we're going to be turning to audience Q&A. So please get your questions ready, and definitely feel free to submit them at any time in the chat on YouTube, or using the hashtag BPCLive on Twitter. So I'm going to turn to some policy questions, kind of thinking about some of the policy frameworks and models that are already out there that we could potentially use and build on, and kind of thinking about this in the terms of if we all had the magic wand where we could just wave it and get what we wanted. Jonathan, you actually literally wrote a book about the Farm Bill, or the book on the Farm Bill. So I bet you've spent some time thinking about, what would you change about it if you could? So what are your thoughts on how Congress and USDA could better incentivize conservation practices through design and implementation of Farm Bill programs?
That's a risky question. How would we redo this? So something jumps out at me that, particularly since we're talking about and the myriad of challenges we have in front of us. So I think not only is conservation an investment now, but I think it presents an incredible opportunity as we think through policies going forward. If we look at our political landscape and we hear all the talk about the rural and urban divide and the partisan polarization, conservation is one of those areas that bridges that divide and actually gets a lot of bipartisan interest and focus in a Farm Bill debate and elsewhere. It's the kind of investment that you don't have to be on a farm to understand what it means. Like you might have to understand with crop insurance or other support programs. You can understand that investing in cleaner water and helping sink carbon in soils not only helps the farmer, but helps far off the farm. And so I think it presents that incredible opportunity. Certainly one of the challenges we see, we struggle with where we're going to spend the money and how much we have available. From the farmer's perspective and from the conservation policy perspective, you mentioned some of the barriers. And I would say if one of the barriers around this policy is the lack of real connection to that farm risk component, to the farm economic side. What does it look like in terms of prices and yields and incomes and cash rent challenges? And thinking about our conservation policy, particularly the working lands type programs around that set of economic challenges. For 85 years now, we've been trying to provide better support programs for farmers dealing with low prices and yield challenges. And we've got quite an apparatus of that, but we have failed, I think, to better blend across these, thinking about crop insurance and conservation, thinking about conservation assistance and price and yield risk at the farm level, and being able to work those policies together better so that again, we come back to that big barrier for the farmer looking to adopt conservation and challenged by competitors at the cash rent level. We don't leave that individual at a disadvantage when they have to negotiate with a landlord. We don't leave that individual at a disadvantage over the longer term because they can't afford the investment and the time it takes to get through it. So I think there's real opportunity. Both Colin and Christy mentioned, market potential, how we think through ecosystem services markets, how we think through the potential for carbon markets, and try to jumpstart those things with policy. But to me, those signal that there's this challenge around these policies to really connect them with the farmers' risk and financial set of issues. And sorting those out, I think, becomes a great debate. We've seen members from both parties, both sides of the hill, think through different policy options, the way we might get creative with loan programs, the way we might get creative with the CRP program, and different kind of aspects of that where we can think about expanding the acreage footprint that we're seeing in conservation and address funding challenges, and then that farm level economic and risk set of issues. So I wish I had been able to glean from all this, some grand idea. I don't know that it's maybe that it even exists, but I do think it offers an incredible potential to break through some of this and debate out some policy options that look at a broader spectrum and look across conservation and farm risk and economic issues.
Yeah, that's right. I know I'll channel my colleague Robert Bonney here by saying it's not going to be a silver bullet, but it's going to be a silver buckshot. So there's lots of different angles that we can look at these challenges from. And so, Colin, I saw, back in May, you wrote a New York Times op-ed during the worst of every, the shutdowns about the need for a modern civilian conservation corps. So how could that model, do you think, be adapted to today's challenges?
Yes, I mean, just think about all the work that Jonathan just said was needed and all that Christy said was needed, right? And then think about the number of jobs, that are necessary. I mean, right now, we're estimating that more than almost a third of folks under 30 are unemployed or furloughed right now. About 40% of folks under 30 work in either food service, hospitality, or retail. And so a lot of that isn't going to come back, at least not in the near term. And so, I think this idea of making sure that young people have economic opportunities is incredibly important. And frankly, what better way to put a lot of young folks to work, folks of all backgrounds, and make sure it's fully representative of the country's diversity. But what better way to put them to work than solving these connected challenges all across the country? And look, and there's it's funny. I get comments all the time saying, well, I don't know if young folks these days are going to work, and they're so attached to their phone. And it was different in 1933 when folks were and more folks were living in suburban area, in rural areas than in urban areas. I was an AmeriCorps volunteer, so I'm biased, but I think folks would jump at the chance. I think if the next administration or this administration offered this up as a real opportunity at scale, that you would see folks really excited about working in forests and working, doing grassland restoration or doing work in coastlines or restoring our parks. And we have new funding from the Great American Outdoors Act. We could put folks to work through that. The needs are almost limitless, right? We have one thing we're good at in conservation. We're good at making plans. So we have state wildlife action plans. We have state forest action plans. We have state outdoor recreation plans. We have coastal hazard plans. We have every kind of federal plan on top of it. And then we don't fund them, right? We fund a fraction of it. So then, the agencies have to figure out which 2% of the plans they're going to implement. Imagine doing that at scale. I mean, imagine doing that. And look, there's places where, a youth kind of a tree army wouldn't make sense. And there's obviously a lot of work to go around. But I mean, having that kind of force, we're talking, 3-4 million youth working, and not just at the federal level, but with state agencies, with NGOs, with local governments, really doing work in every community across the country to do everything we're talking about, right? Make sure that we are making communities more resilient, that we're sequestering carbon through natural solutions, we're cleaning up waterways, we're cleaning up air quality. It gets pretty exciting pretty quickly. And I think that's one of the reasons why this idea that many people have been working on for years, right, has gained such bipartisan support. I mean, the fact that folks like Chris Coons and Martin Heinrich and Dick Durbin and Cory Booker and Ron Wyden are walking arm in arm with folks like Lisa Murkowski and Roger Wicker and Roy Blunt and and Senator Cassidy. I mean, like there's something to this idea of national service combined with conservation that is in that kind of unicorn of policy space right now that could actually get done, even given what we're dealing with the dysfunction on the Hill right now.
That's great. We got unicorns. We got silver buckshot. It's perfect. Colin mentioned the Great American Outdoors Act, and Christy, I was curious if you had thoughts on that and the new legislation to permanently fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So how do you think that we should be building on these new funding mechanisms to ensure that more projects are actually implemented that are good for recreation, for the land, for the climate?
Yeah, Leslie, it's another great question. And we were incredibly excited about the final passage. It's only taken 20 years of some of our careers, and it was a monumental moment to get the Great American Outdoors Act over the finish line and signed into law. And that also included some really important new resources for deferred maintenance on our public lands. So everything from trails to parking lots to facilities, road construction. And I think so Great American Outdoors Act, full and permanent funding for Land and Water Conservation Fund. LWCF for nearly 60 years now has been absolutely critical for doing federal land acquisition work, both fee title, so property that our federal agencies actually own and manage, as well as conservation easement work on working landscapes. So if you think about the Rocky Mountain front, and a lot of the big migration corridors for big game species coming through the Rocky Mountain front of Montana, Land and Water Conservation Fund has done conservation easement work with private landowners there, and it's thousands and thousands of acres now in protection, and building a climate resilient system where you don't have a bunch of mini ranchette development. You've got 4,000 to 7,000 acre ranches that have been, often fifth generation Montanans that are still living on the land. So LWCF is a tremendous resource for continuing to keep intact land. Fragmentation, especially compounded by climate change, is going to have significant impacts. As much as we can, we want to tap into the resources at the federal level and state and local and private to keep our lands intact, to protect migration corridors. Species are going to need to move and migrate, whether within the aquatic space or the terrestrial space. It's going to be really important. And then, I think just throwing in a little bit of science as we think about this, for the U.S. to meet its Paris Agreement plus standards, the latest science is saying a fifth of that could be done through natural climate solutions. So not only do we want to think about the existing funding sources that we have, like Land and Water Conservation Fund, we track Function 300, which is a super wonky term for the natural resources and environment portion of the federal budget that continues to decline. So we're going to need new funding sources, obviously some sort of new carbon climate comprehensive package that potentially could generate billions of dollars in new revenues. We want to see at least a portion of that go to natural climate solutions, both because it's going to help us meet our sequestration, resilience, adaptation standards and metrics that we're going to want to try to hit. But also it's just, the way to really think comprehensively about how do we address this. It's not just emissions reductions and mitigation of greenhouse gases, but it's getting our natural systems to really help us, be more resilient, be adapted, but also be rebounding when climate changes are hitting them. So, again, sort of along with, multiple streams of silver buckshot, we've got all these tools in the toolbox, but we need new tools in there as well.
Great, thanks, Christy. So please continue to submit your questions in the chat feature. We have a couple that are coming in, so I'm going to start moving to take some of the audience questions. And I really liked what you were saying, Christy, about kind of the thinking about this in terms of what kinds of environmental outcomes we're hoping to get from these projects and programs. And someone has a question from Twitter about what is the projected timeline of thinking about when we would actually see results from some of these approaches. And this could be inclusive of some of the agricultural programs as well.
Yeah, I'll let Jonathan take the ag side. We talk a lot about this in the natural infrastructure space, where the the absolute best day for gray infrastructure is its first day. The worst day for natural infrastructure is its first day. And natural infrastructure just continues to get better and better with time. So you think about, wetlands restoration, coastal reef restoration, and, oyster reef restoration, where you've got this infrastructure in place and nature just continues to become more resilient with time. So depending on the structure, depending on the type of approach, if it's a forestry planning project with carbon mitigation goals, it could be, depending on the life cycle of that forest, it could be 10 years. If it's a really fast growing forest, it could be much longer. Some of these solutions are longer term. And, it's a big reason why we need a lot of them and really think about how do we multiply the effects of our natural systems. But Jonathan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the ag space.
Yeah, between mentions of budget function, New Deal, and Dust Bowl, like the two functioning brain cells in my head have collided. So this is fast. This is fantastic as a discussion. I think part of our challenge is that to this question, and I'm not picking on the person that asked it, is we too narrowly define that. And something that jumps out at me, we think about investing around conservation. And you think about what Colin has mentioned with the potential for jobs, and being at a university and watching young people, they'll work and they are excited to put their energies and their hearts into something they believe in and something they can see the benefits out of. So I think the investments, beginning this discussion or really moving things forward, begins to pay benefits right away, because I think you see that whether it's in terms of jobs, whether it's in terms of just the demonstration that we're investing in long-term aspects for our environment, for our country. And so I think there's a much broader spectrum of the return on this than I think we too often don't give credit or enough credit to that potential. In a similar way around the challenges that agriculture is facing. If we want to rebuild markets and we want to compete globally and compete in new markets and even new opportunities in this country, these kinds of investments begin to pay off because we can start marketing American farm products as greener, as more sustainably produced, as more resilient, on and on and on. So there's a lot of those opportunities that I think if we just look to say, did it capture enough carbon in the first 2 years, or did it cut nutrient loss? We're missing the broader potential of this kind of policy, because it really is. There's a whole host of benefits that come around that I think, and look, I've spent enough time wrestling with CBO scores. I know that doesn't get scored. I know it doesn't get that kind of inside the arena, scorekeeping, but it is important. And there has to be a way to think through that that really takes into account that we are talking about jobs. We are talking about cleaner water for schools and communities. We are talking about a host of things that don't show up on the CBO bottom line, but that really do matter and really do matter right away. So I would push us to think a little broader and think a little more in depth about what we're really investing in and how it plays out across communities and society.
That's really helpful, Jonathan. And, I think we have a similar question coming in from Julian Reyes that kind of plays off some of what you were talking about in terms of thinking about trade-offs between near-term benefits, but long-term, the questions around national debt and the fact that, we have questions in this country about long-term fiscal stability. And so, what's the balance there, and what should we be thinking about in terms of striking that balance in our policy solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the question, but we have an entire government budget right now, particularly on the kind of domestic side, and actually maybe for the military side as well, where we're paying for the consequences of not making upfront investments. Right? We don't make that ounce of prevention investment, so we end up paying that pound of cure on the back end. I mean, we don't score the $200 billion supplemental package we need after hurricane season, even though we know that for a fraction of that, maybe 1/6 of that cost, or maybe 1/10 of that cost, we could make places more resilient to avoid that kind of damage. And it's funny, I got asked this question during a natural resources hearing, and we have a $24 trillion debt, I guess, after the tax cuts, $22 trillion debt. virtually none of that is related to conservation. Almost none. There's a little piece of ARA from 2009. There's a little bit for some of the supplemental disaster relief packages, but that's more kind of recovery than it is natural resource restoration. And so I'd make the case that if you want to bend the long-term curve on like federal spending, making upfront investments in conservation is one of the most fiscally prudent things you can possibly do. We know that if you invest in forest management, we reduce fire damage. We know that if we invest in wetland conservation, we can reduce flooding, damage upstream. We know if we invest in species conservation, like they propose in the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, if we do it upstream before they are close to being endangered, it's a hell of a lot cheaper and a lot less litigious than if they already reached that breaking point. Yet in almost every case, we don't act until the crisis occurs. And so I just make the case that if we're going to end up deficit spending for an economic recovery, why not invest in things that have such long-term returns that we actually can bend the cost curve in the long term. But right now, we don't have a $24 trillion deficit. We have a $40 to $50 trillion deficit because we're not scoring any of the climate impacts that we know are coming if we don't act. And so I'd actually argue that those things that are going to reduce our risk on climate, those are going to save money from not having to do as much disaster relief in the future, should score as revenue neutral or even revenue saving. But that's just not the way we're set up with CBO. It's not the way we kind of think about things. But as a result, we end up, again, paying for that pound of cure, which is a hell of a lot more expensive than that ounce of prevention on the front end.
That's a really great point. And, I think we have a question here that Chris Burke has asked related to, are there any lessons learned or best practices overseas? Like, what are other countries doing in the natural climate solutions space that we could, think about and consider here?
I'll throw one out, and it just recently hit the news where I know there's been a lot of thinking about how to tap into the opportunities to partner with the insurance and reinsurance industry. And there's an example down in Mexico right now of how the local community and the insurance companies have come together to ensure the first natural system in the world, which is a reef and mangrove system in Mexico that's going to protect the adjoining community. So that there's been this decision to, long-term invest in that natural system to help with storm surge and sea level rise and a lot of different impacts that potentially are coming down the pipeline with climate. So I think there have been some initial discussions in the United States with the equivalent insurance reinsurance industry and some opportunities when you think about oyster reefs and mangroves and some of the adjacent coastal systems. So I thought that was really cool to have hit the press, a sign of good news in this otherwise fairly dark era that we're pushing through right now.
Yeah, and I'll just add a couple. There's been some really interesting kind of reforestation efforts, particularly in kind of Central Asia and in South Asia, looking at ways to, and hopefully it's all done ecologically appropriately, but as a way to put a bunch of folks to work and actually reduce flooding. And actually, it was one of the reasons they were concerned is these massive mudslides that we're seeing in places like northern India and Pakistan and going into Bangladesh. There's also the Germans are a decent place to look too. I think they kind of latched on to natural climate solutions fairly early, but they also looked at it as a way to put a ton of folks to work as they're going through an energy transition. And so they've spent a lot of money on, they don't call it reclaiming, but they said, kind of reclaiming abandoned mines, different degraded lands as a way to put folks to work in the same places where, maybe some of the jobs are being displaced. And so I think there are models out there, right? I mean, there's other parts of the world that are investing in like orphan well reclamation, trying to plug and clean up different landscapes that have been scarred as a way, again, to put people to work where the jobs are being impacted. So I think there's a lot we can learn. And frankly, some of the most exciting investments are part of the I don't know what they call it. It's like the green package that the EU put together. A ton of that is natural climate solutions. And I think, frankly, they're probably slightly ahead of us as a country in terms of as political entities in those countries, because they're seeing natural climate solutions on equal footing, on par with clean energy efficiency, advanced transportation, the other sectors. I mean, and that's frankly, if your viewers only take away one thing today, that this is no longer like kind of a niche field, right? I mean, like there's no way to achieve the climate goals, as Christy said, without natural climate solutions playing a huge role, without working lands playing a whole role. We can't get there through technology alone. We're going to need natural solutions, and frankly, we need a lot more attention to it. We've spent billions on advocacy related to clean energy, and a fraction of that related to this suite, which is, as Chrissy said, 20, 30% of the overall global solutions if you look at both conservation lands and working lands together.
That's great. So we had a question, about the international picture, but maybe swinging all the way to the other end, what can we think about in terms of opportunities for partnerships between federal agencies and state agencies, or even kind of local agencies? And I think, this is also relevant in the context of agricultural extension and, lessons learned that can help for natural climate solutions.
I'm going to guess that you were hitting me with that when I heard extension, and I want to kind of focus in on a couple things, and that we have some incredible infrastructure in place, whether it's extension, the soil water conservation districts, in which we do have this sort of federal to local connection. And they've been challenged with funding cuts and, frankly, in some respects, just kind of lack of attention or investment or enough longer term sort of thinking about how we do this. So I think those core infrastructure opportunities exist, and I think you come back around to thinking about climate and working with that connection from the federal level to the local. We want to think about how we reinvigorate some of the things we have, some things we've put in place in the 30s. I mean, the Soil and Water Conservation District is a product of the Dust Bowl and the efforts to get a handle on that and rethink and recreate or get creative about how we reinvigorate those things we've put in place and look to those opportunities as a great connector between the state and local levels. I mean, USDA has an incredible footprint at local communities across the country, and so I think there's a huge set of opportunities there. But it's going to come back to, the front end policy and funding challenges that we have. And I was sort of laughing that maybe one of your future discussions should be around reforming the Budget Control Act and rethinking what it means to invest and spend versus just this very narrow window. But I don't want to suggest anything that's beyond the scope. But I think there's a lot there.
Thanks, Colin.
Yeah, and to Jonathan's point, I mean, the states have amazing capacity, right? Knowing the landscape. I think, I wail against the Army Corps as much as anybody. The Army Corps has actually done a really good job in some places, partnering with states on natural climate solutions. Some of the coastal, like in Delaware, when Hurricane Sandy came through, if it wasn't for our partnership with the Corps, we had restored wetlands and dunes and everything else. Frankly, we had restored systems where in New Jersey, not to make fun of our friends in the Garden State, they had paved over a lot of things. We were able to survive that storm much better than neighbors just 15 miles away, and this is another area where it's gone from being kind of theoretical to being really applied. The Water Resources Development Act, if you go back to 2014, 2016, 2018, everyone had more and more natural infrastructure kind of built into more natural climate solutions, more on the resilient side, but obviously there's carbon co-benefits there. And the 2021, I mean, the House bill is pretty aggressive. The Senate bill is pretty aggressive, and I give credit to John Barrasso and Tom Carper and Congressman Graves and Congressman DeFazio for kind of having those principles be in there. But I actually think, I can't believe I'm going to say the Army Corps is a model for anything. But the way in which they work on these natural defense projects could be a way. And frankly, I'd love to see more of that at Interior. EPA does a good job with kind of the wastewater programs are more pipes and kind of pipes and plants, but maybe not as much with some of the natural stormwater solutions. So I think there's a ton of opportunities for states to work together. And a lot of that's administrative. A lot of those aren't restraints that are placed by the funding itself from Congress. It's just the way they've always been used. And they've always been used for gray infrastructure. And they easily could be used for greener infrastructure with just a little bit of guidance and a little bit of conversation.
Yeah, and I think I'll probably just add as part of that, building on this. I mean, I think some of the most innovative projects we've seen have been through federal-state partnership, and a lot of times it's been the states who have taken the lead. And thinking about the Louisiana Coastal Master Plan is a key opportunity where the state is just charged ahead and have this really amazing multi-year plan in place that integrates natural and the gray green infrastructure opportunities and are working across the federal family. But it's really the state in the lead for that. And, finding a lot of their own funding. We're seeing this also with the Everglades system, where the states have been really driving ahead in terms of, being willing to put together their own bond initiatives, really being aggressive in terms of conservation funding to advance these natural system conservation efforts.
All right, well, we are about 3 extra minutes, and I'd love to just go around Robin one last time to hear a little bit from each of you. Kind of what would you like your takeaway for our viewers about the opportunities for bipartisan agreement around natural climate solutions? Jonathan, how about we start with you?
Oh, okay. I also would be remiss if we didn't at least put a plug in as we think about some incredible institutions at the state level in our universities, where we have young people looking for jobs and young people who are very passionate about things they can do for their communities and their world. And we are hitting major budget crunches in this pandemic situation, which I think brings to this point. I agree with what Colin and Christy have talked about and how there is an incredible opportunity to invest here. And I think it is an investment that is much broader and deeper than we give it credit for. And one of the things I'll do, sort of keeping with my role on maybe the farmer angle, is just how much, when we think about the land footprint in today's farm community, the 360 million acres of potential that makes agriculture a potentially huge player in this discussion, a huge resource, and a group of people who can really step up and help make a difference. And so from a bipartisan standpoint, I see federal conservation policy, particularly on working lands, as an incredible opportunity to rethink how we do it, to make it more relevant to some of the farmers' bottom line challenges, and to give farmers an opportunity to be a real resource and a real contributor to the solutions we need going forward. So I encourage everybody to take a look at the conservation policies and to think about how we can invest going forward.
Christy, do you want to?
Yeah, I can go next. Thank you for this opportunity. I think we're all really engaged and spending a lot of time thinking about this, and there's so many opportunities here in order to build coalitions, amplify the voices that are out there. And we think about conservation being a nonpartisan field, and we've seen that over and over again just in the past couple of years. When you take something like Great American Outdoors Act with tremendous amount of support from both parties in both the House and Senate. There's a path forward for comprehensive climate legislation, and natural climate solutions are going to be one of those paths. And it's talking with members of the Senate Select Committee, Braun and Stabenow and Coons, and bringing them together and talking about ways we can work together and unite rural and urban communities to be solution focused. And so that's what I'd love to leave with folks is natural climate solutions. They're what we need to be doing. We need to be doing them now. We need funding to do them now. And let's not make them partisan issues. Let's make them nonpartisan and bipartisan.
Yeah, and I want to start by just thanking BPC for leaning in on this issue, the work that you're doing, Leslie, and your team. As Christy said, this is one of those areas that could be entirely bipartisan. And there's going to be conversations about spending levels and the like, as we're seeing with the COVID package. But when it gets down to it, these are investments that are going to help every single congressional district. They're going to help every single Senate in every single state. And frankly, if we can do exactly what Christy said, keep it nonpartisan, keep it, the sky's the limit. And frankly, I think, if you're going to take away two things from you, the first one is climate solutions are real. They need to be a real part of the solution. The second piece is that the level of investment has to be real. It can't be an afterthought. We spend tens of billions of dollars every few years on clean energy incentives. Very, very important, bringing the cost curve down, deploying resources. We spend a fraction of that on conservation practices on the ground. Really, like Jonathan said, the Farm Bill is the major driver. The other programs, if you add them all up, don't reach a fraction of that on other types of landscapes. And so, I think we should be talking about $100 to $200 billion worth of investments in these areas, and it should be everything, right? It should be forest work on restoring our forests, it should be wetlands, we don't have great grassland restoration programs, and there's no kind of NACA equivalent for grasslands. And so that's one thing, we'd like to try to move, because I think there's huge opportunities for carbon and revitalizing communities, also helping in the ranching landscape. We need to be talking about investments in our shrublands. And we have a whole lot of degraded lands that need to work, from mines, from hard rock mines, from coal mines, uranium mines, work with oil and gas fields that are no longer in operation. Then you think about the waterways, from surface water work to the big estuaries. I mean, the amount of work we need to do is massive. And frankly, they're all things that have massive co-benefits. They all have broad bipartisan support. You get to bring together great coalitions of folks that are working on the landscape, folks that are hunting on the landscape, folks that are that have historical roots on the landscape. I mean, it's one of the great uniters. And if we can do that well at scale, there can be a lot of fights over the next couple of years. But this could be one place that truly shows that bipartisan is not dead in the U.S. Capitol. If anything, conservation could be the place we have to start to rebuild that kind of ethic across our entire government. So what better place to do it than in restoration?
Thank you all so much again for joining us today and sharing your insights and experiences. Really appreciate everyone who has joined viewing. Please subscribe to our mailing list and to our BPC YouTube channel for notifications on upcoming live events. There's going to be more in our series for the Farm and Forest Carbon Solutions Initiative, and definitely invite you to please stay in touch on these issues. And thanks again. We'll see you next time.